A while back, friend of the show Pax Tube released a video on the Inquisition in a very similar vein to his video on the Crusades, where just like his video on the Crusades, he plagiarizes dubious sources. The video is quite old at this point, but it's one that I've been asked to talk about since I've touched on the topic of anti-Semitism in medieval Spain. Here's a quick primer on who Pax Tube is. He's a so-called trad-cath, a modern reimagining of Catholicism that seeks to, quote, return to a more authentic form of Catholicism. Most are united by their rejection of the Second Vatican Council in 1965, which introduced a lot of doctrinal changes. An important one was the Church's new assertion that Jews cannot be held accountable for the death of Jesus. Please remember this, it's important for later in the video. Pax Tube is of course unabashedly right-wing. That's not an attack, that's a descriptor that I think he'd be proud of. He has a tendency to select for dubious sources. In my past video on him, he cited far-right anti-Muslim blog Gates of Vienna. Gates of Vienna hosted the writings of Norwegian far-right figure Fjordman, who ideologically inspired the neo-Nazi mass murderer and terrorist who committed the 2011 Norway attacks. The terrorist, of course, cited the blog in his manifesto, so Pax Tube is in good company. It's important for you to understand who he is when he describes his channel as, quote, YouTube's voice of reason, and, quote, fact-based and non-partisan. Pax Tube leads off by talking about how popular depictions of the Inquisition have created skewed ideas of what the Inquisition was actually like, which is a fair point. He makes reference to the movie The Pit and the Pendulum, Edgar Allan Poe's short story on which it is based, as well as Assassin's Creed. All of these are, of course, works of fiction featuring the Spanish Inquisition, but intended for something other than authenticity. But their impact on popular conceptions cannot be denied. He makes numerous references to how all of these conceptions of the Inquisition are at odds with the conceptions of modern historians. I've cut bits in the middle here for time, but the timecodes for the bits I'm showing are on screen, so if you want the whole argument, you can go watch his video, which I've also cited. Here's Pax Tube.
Films like History of the World Part 1 show the Inquisition as a bunch of wacky priests torturing Jews. It's become amazing how out of touch this perception is with the conclusions of actual historians. Since then, many unsuspecting people treated those views as truth despite them being largely debunked by modern research.
He talks a big game about his sources, so let's have a look. We'll go through his citations one by one. The first one I was kind of confused by because it's cited like a book, but no such book exists. I looked up the author and couldn't find much on him, but he is cited in a somewhat negative light in an article by the Dutch Radboud University's Faculty of Theology. I looked for the author's full bibliography and the ones that I found were published in 1905. That's when it struck me that this author likely died over or almost 100 years ago. I found the article that Pax Tube cites though on Catholic.com, that's probably where he got it, but he didn't cite it properly. The site specifies that this article is printed in unabridged form from the Catholic Encyclopedia, which was published between 1907 and 1912. It also carries this fun disclaimer. Like most works that are more than a century old though, it may occasionally use anachronistic language or present outdated scientific information. Accordingly, in offering this resource, Catholic Answers does not thereby endorse every assertion or phrase in it. He cites God's Jury by Colin Murphy, who is not a historian by trade, and the book represents a work of pop history, which can be fine, but it's best to avoid relying too much on pop history when making a video with bold assertions such as the ones made by Pax Tube. He used an interesting article by Robert P. Lockwood, a Catholic columnist, also not a historian. He cites an NPR article, also completely fine in context. It's an interview with the aforementioned Colin Murphy, author of the pop history book. Completely fine to cite, but also not an academic work of history representing modern research on the topic. He cites an Encyclopedia Britannica article, which is authored by two genuine historians, and contributed to by many others. I actually went through the citations on this article in order to find sources for this video. His last citation is to an opinion piece on what seems to be a blog for Catholic men, written by a high school teacher of theology and history. This is also fine, you don't need a PhD in history to be a historian. However, considering this is the final citation, I think he could have chosen better sources. Before moving on, I'd like to say a quick word on the historiography of the Inquisition. That is, the research that exists on this topic, how it began, and how it has evolved. According to Henry Kamen, a former professor of the University of Barcelona and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, modern study of the Spanish Inquisition began in 1976. I reference Henry Kamen because so does Pax Tube later in the video, despite Henry Kamen not being in his list of citations. Pax Tube here referenced an actual academic historian on the topic. That was a mistake. This book that I'm reading from was originally published in 1965, but has had to undergo serious revisions since to account for recent research. History is an ever-evolving field. It can sometimes be hard to keep up as new discoveries are made, consensus is shift, and something you thought you knew to be true is proven false.
I'll be addressing the biggest points surrounding the Inquisition, the history of Inquisitions, the number of people killed, the methods used by inquisitors, and whether the concept of Inquisition itself is against Christianity. In this video, you'll be finding out why the Inquisition was justified and important to Christianity's integrity as a religion.
No, we won't.
As Christianity became the faith of the Roman Empire and the European kingdoms, the faith became understood as the fundamental, unifying principle of culture. To step outside the faith was viewed as a violation of Christian unity, and a denial of the correct ordering of the world. The popular community, the clergy, and the secular authorities all agreed on these principles.
This is an insane claim to make that completely homogenizes the diverse history of Christianity in Europe over a period that spans several centuries. Pax Tube retrofits later developments, which I presume he learned about for his video on the Crusades, onto the period prior to the Middle Ages in Europe. A good example of how Christianity was well on its way towards vastly divergent teachings at this point is the Filioque. I may have mispronounced that. In 325, Roman Emperor Constantine I convened the Council of Nicaea, in an attempt to bring the many disparate views of early Christianity into order, to settle debates and establish a consensus. This itself was a product of how diverse Christianity was. A major point of contention was the Trinity and the role of the Father and the Son in it. Over the course of the centuries after the year 325, in the Latin West, a tradition holding God's very mode of being as different began to take hold. The difference was in whether or not the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Son, the nuances of which I will not pretend to understand. The tradition began to diverge from the Greek East as early as the 5th century. But while this was being practiced in the West, it didn't come up as a topic in Eastern sources until the 7th century, and a theological response didn't appear until the 9th century. By the 11th century, the Church was split in two, partly over this question. The process by which a semblance of Christian unity arose is very important to understand in order to understand the Spanish Inquisition. The idea of a singular Christian world or a singular Muslim world was not something that began to really take shape until during and after the First Crusade, which began in 1096. If you've seen my past video on Pax Tube, then some of this is going to be familiar to you. But while we're retreading familiar ground, we are laying the foundation for new stuff that I'm going to present. Bolcher of Chartres, a first-hand account chronicler of the Crusade, counted some 21 different linguistic, regional, and ethno-national groups in the First Crusade. Islamic sources in Arabic described Europeans as, quote, Romans, Greeks, Franks, Slavs, and so on. However, the memorialization of war is very conducive to us versus them narratives, through creating stories about a brotherhood united by common cause. This sort of rhetoric becomes more and more common after the First Crusade, with Europeans increasingly identifying themselves as one culture, with proto-racialized ideas of a European race united by Christianity. This didn't occur on its own, of course. This idea of Europeans as a race actually began by uniting the enemy into a conception of a single race. In the Christian West, far from regular interaction with Muslims in their literature and in their imaginations, they constructed an idea of a Muslim race. And you can see this imagined race appearing in places where there's little Muslim contact. In areas with contact between Christians and Muslims, the Muslim peoples are described as, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciations here, Agarenes, Ismailites, Moors, and so on. But in the Latin West, they're all becoming Saracens. Following the First Crusade, of course, these conceptions were institutionalized into medieval Christianity in the form of crusading. We are one and we have one common enemy. This, of course, did not stop the Crusaders from sacking the Christian city of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, and for Byzantines to consider the adoption of the Filioque doctrine an ethnic betrayal. I should note that it is deeply ironic for Pax Tube to espouse the necessity for Catholic unity when he's not in communion with the Catholic Church, as he rejects the Second Vatican Council. In other words, Pax Tube is probably a heretic. Not that it matters. And just in case you forgot, the Second Vatican Council was the one where the Catholic Church exonerated the Jews. It's going to come up.
The first large, organized Inquisition came in 1184 in France as a response to the Catharist heresy. Catharism was not some kind of early Protestantism or anything like that. It was essentially its own new religion. It blended together Gnosticism, which claimed to have a secret source of religious knowledge, and Manichaeism, which taught that matter is evil. The Catharists believed in two gods, the good God of the New Testament and the evil God of the Old Testament. Following their belief that the material world is evil, they engaged in ritualistic suicide, rejected procreation, and refused to take oaths.
Of note here, he glosses over the fact that the nature and existence of Catharism is an open and hotly debated question among experts on the topic. According to some views among experts, the existence of something one can legitimately call Catharism is entirely a fabrication by the Church, and early historians wrote on the topic. For example, here's Mark Gregory Pegg's view on the topic. Catharism was neither a Balkan heresy, a construct of the persecuting society, or, for that matter, even a medieval phenomenon, as it has never existed, except as an enduring invention of late 19th century scholars of religion and history. It's far too much for me to sum up here for a passing remark by Pax Tube, but he condenses what's an open question of likeness between multiple disparate heresies, and the nature of whether these multiple heresies were a reaction to persecution and overreach by the church, or the persecution was a response to the heresy, into just one thing. Quoting further from Peg, "Unfortunately, the whole edifice of Catharism collapses without a name, for when scholars use it, promiscuously stamping almost every instance of heresy in the 12th and 13th century with a label, that is, apart from the Waldensians, they create the very reality they supposedly discover. The epitome and lodestar of this self-fulfilling method is Arno Borst's Die Catharer, which compiles citation after citation to Cathars by deciding that any reference to Manichaeans, Arians, Patarenes, the heretics, or accusation of dualism, however vague or inconsistent, was a reference to Catharism." Claire Taylor says these so-called heretics potentially call themselves good Christians, and posits this as a potential alternative to calling them Cathars, however also recognizes that it is kind of impractical. Pax Tube presents this all as an orderly thing that can be easily summed up by a doctrine and beliefs, but the reality is that pretty scant reliable sources attesting the actual beliefs of these heresies exist. What we know is that dualistic heresies existed in the region, but the Conference of Experts at University College London in 2013 that spawned the book I've been citing found that evidence for organized dualism in Europe, quote, between the Rhone and the Garonne, before the Albigensian Crusade is very slight at best, and that after 1250 it is both abundant and substantial. In other words, any sort of unified heresy was the result of persecution, not the precursor to persecution. Or in other words, the Inquisition did not occur in response to the Cathar heresy, but it may have occurred in response to a heresy or several heresies. According to Antonian Senis, Peg says, quote, "The Inquisitors' accounts of the beliefs of the behavior of the people they called heretici were based on their own expectations, rather on what the dependents actually said. He found no persuasive evidence either of widely accepted theological dualism or of long-standing hierarchical organization. Instead, he postulated and vividly described local holiness revolving around the, quote, good men, whose precepts and influences arose from and corresponded to local circumstances and conditions, which began to organize, taking on the aspect of a sect, mainly under the pressure of persecution during the Albigensian Crusade."
The dreaded Spanish Inquisition sentenced to death, wait for it, 3,000 to 5,000 people, about 2.7% of all cases, and that's over the course of several centuries. Historian Henry Kamen, an expert on the Spanish Inquisition, wrote, "We can, in all probability, accept the estimate, made on the basis of available documentation, that a maximum of 3,000 persons may have suffered death during the entire history of the tribunal."
This is where Pax Tube makes a mistake of using the words of an actual historian. This is a misreading, perhaps deliberate, or perhaps accidental, of what Henry Kamen is saying. I had to find the page number in one of 4 separate editions of this book because Pax Tube doesn't cite the page number. He doesn't even mention the book at all in his bibliography. I did find it though, and it's on page 253 of the 4th edition of the Spanish Inquisition, a historical revision, published in 2014 by Yale University Press. Here's the text, and you may notice a section above and below the highlighted text that Pax Tube did not mention. First, we have suggested above, chapter 3, that taking into account all the tribunals of Spain up to about 1520, it is unlikely that more than 2,000 people were executed for heresy in that period by the Inquisition. For one, this is specifically about heresy tribunals, not all deaths caused by the Spanish Inquisition, and while death was the most severe punishment the office could mete out, its other punishments were also very severe and could have similar outcomes. Another point to make is that the way Pax Tube reads the sentence may imbue it with a bit more confidence than Henry Kamen intended for it. Allow me to read the sentence with different tone, with an emphasis on the comma which Pax Tube most likely accidentally took out. "We can in all probability accept the estimate made on the basis of available documentation." There are a lot of qualifying words in this sentence. This is historian speak for "we do not exactly know, so I'm being careful." Henry Kamen believes this to be true based on the data, as he should until he sees contradictory evidence, but he goes to great lengths elsewhere in the book to explain the sheer amount of uncertainty that accompanies figures like this. A few pages earlier, Henry Kamen says this: "Analysis of the punishments decreed by tribunals should ideally be based on reliable data, but these do not exist. Nearly all the documentation on the early years of the Inquisition has disappeared, and for subsequent periods the records are often incomplete. And also, he says, above all, the surviving records reflect neither the number of offenses nor the scale of inquisitorial activity." Very quickly I should outline what executions by the Inquisition means. As Kamen outlines on the top of the very same page, the accused cannot be executed by the church itself, so they pass the sentence and then hand them over to the secular authorities. Importantly, he says, quote, "In all this there was no pretense that the Inquisition was not the body directly and fully responsible for the deaths that occurred." Pax Tube says something like this in the video, but gives it a slight slant that might leave it open to interpretation whether or not it was the church that actually passed the sentence or was responsible for the deaths.
If the guilty persisted, he would be turned over to the secular authorities. In other words, the church conducted investigations and trials, while punishment was left to the civil state.
This may seem like a minor gripe, but I think he would have done well to emphasize that the church carried out the sentencing also, and the church did carry out punishments. They just didn't carry out the punishments which they were forbidden by law to carry out, such as executions. The word they used to euphemistically describe execution was relaxation, as in the accused was relaxed to the secular authorities. If you're sentenced to be relaxed, you're sentenced to death. Pax Tube mentions those executed, but not those burned in effigy. Quoting Kamen, the vast majority of those who were relaxed were in fact burnt in effigy only, either because they had died or because they had saved themselves by flight. This is on the very next page from what Pax Tube is reading. Now, the Inquisition most certainly wasn't as bloodthirsty as it is sometimes depicted, but the number that the office managed to burn should also be held up against the number it intended to burn. Quoting further, it must be remembered, of course, that the apparently low overall death rate masks a very high rate in the first half-century of the Inquisition, and a consistently high rate affecting people of Jewish and Muslim origin. The executions probably made no impact on the population as a whole, but were a significant burden on Conversos. Those who were, quote, relaxed did not always die at the stake. They were normally given the choice between repenting before the auto de fe reached its climax, in which case they were, quote, mercifully strangled when the flames were lit, or remaining unrepentant, in which case they were roasted alive.
The Inquisition mostly sentenced people to a short amount of prison time, and gave religious penalties like requiring people to visit local churches. The majority of people investigated by the Inquisition were those who said things they didn't even know were heretical. And after being corrected, most accepted it and were allowed to go on their way.
While Kamen says that the surviving records are not good enough to reflect the reality of the situation, some numbers do exist for us to look at. In Valencia, in an estimated 3,075 trials between 1566 and 1609, by no means the most bloody or active years of the Inquisition, 44.2% were made to do penance, 40.2% were reconciled, 2.5% were absolved, 9% were suspended, 2.1% burnt in effigy, and 2% burnt in person. These numbers are not at all consistent across locations and time periods and are not reflective of all of Spain. Kamen also presents other numbers for later periods and other locations. In the bloodiest years of the Inquisition at the Tribunal of Toledo, the vast majority of offenders were so-called Judaizers, as in people observing Jewish customs. As I mentioned, there were 5 or technically 6 outcomes for a case. You could be made to do penance, which is what Pax Tube alludes to, where you swear to not commit a sin again in the future and do some sort of religious activities. If the sin was great and you committed it again, you could be liable for a more severe punishment, such as San Benito, that is, wearing a penitent garment similar to a dunce cap. You could also be fined, banished, or condemned to the galleys. The galleys were a secular method by King Ferdinand to get a hold of cheap labor without resorting to open slavery. Slavery essentially by another name. However, as mentioned prior, it was the church who was condemning people to this, not Ferdinand himself. Then there was, of course, the most severe, which was relaxation, which we've already discussed. Absolution meant you were cleared of any wrongdoing, and suspension meant the case and therefore suspicion by your peers would continue to stain you, but you wouldn't be prosecuted yet, but you could be at a later date. Finally, there's reconciliation, which at Valencia accounted for something like 40% of all cases between 1566 and 1609. But I must stress that we do not, to my knowledge at least, know to what degree these numbers can be considered representative for the whole of Spain. Reconciliation was in theory the return of a sinner to the bosom of the church after due spiritual penance had been performed. In practice, it was the most severe punishment the Inquisition could inflict short of relaxation. Quoting further, accused persons could be condemned to flogging and to long spells in prisons or the galleys. In most cases, confiscation of goods occurred, so that even if a prisoner escaped with a prison sentence of a few months, he came out an Orthodox Catholic indeed, but facing a life of beggary. An additional rule, frequently enforced, was that anyone backsliding after reconciliation was to be treated as a relapsed heretic and sent to the stake. Essentially, those reconciled, which at Valencia accounted for 40% of persons, were dispossessed, made homeless and poor, and without others to care for them, they and their dependents would surely suffer greatly. I think it might be safe to make a very rough estimate based on the numbers seen in Kamen's book, which hopefully are representative of the available data, that early on in the Inquisition's history, harsher punishments like reconciliation and burning were more common, but probably didn't outnumber penitence, and that absolution became more common in later years. The two most intense periods of all this are the early years in which Conversos, most often Jews, were targeted, and the period of the Inquisition's activity against Protestants, in which the Inquisition disproportionately targeted them. Even so, that period never approached the intensity of the persecution of Jews, in particular in the early years after the Inquisition's founding. While focusing only on how most people were made to do penitence, he neglects the almost just as many who had their possessions confiscated and the ones who suffered under slavery by another name.
The treatment of Muslims and Jews in Spain reflected Spain's difficult history and struggle for existence through the centuries. Due to constant wars for survival, the Spanish perceived Muslims, and eventually Jews as well, as dangerous groups that couldn't be trusted in their society.
This is a very interesting framing, essentially saying that Spanish Christians, though he refers to them just as the Spanish, had good reason to look into the doings of Muslims and Jews in their country because of the many wars fought against Muslim rulers in the past. Even if we accept this framing, that doesn't explain why they'd go after Jews who they fought no wars against. The idea of a Spanish Christian realm ruling Spain indeed wasn't a certainty in the past when the Caliphate of Al-Andalus ruled most of the peninsula. However, Paradox map game style framing of this, as competing faiths, misrepresents what actually happened over these centuries, quoting Henry Kamen. Spanish lands remained in places under Muslim control for nearly 7 centuries, with the consequence that the Islamic peoples were no less a part of Spain than the Christian and Jewish populations. They intermarried with them and exchanged ideas and languages, so that the 3 religions developed side by side within the Christian and Muslim kingdoms. Modern Spain, that is a singular Spanish kingdom, was founded in the late 1400s, well after the Muslim and subsequent Christian conquests of the peninsula, with the exception of the last holdout in the Emirate of Granada. Everybody who lived here under that period and before the arrival of Christianity to the peninsula was Spanish. To consider only Christians to be Spanish on the basis of adherence to the religion of the Kingdom of Spain, which would come to exist later, is completely anachronistic. The Inquisition came into being alongside a unified Spanish kingdom. It became integral to the creation of a new idea of who could actually be a loyal subject. This was not how things were seen in the past. To consider the past based on these new criteria is anachronistic. Again, we're talking 700 years of intermarriage living side by side, fighting wars against each other, and only right around the founding of the Inquisition did the Spanish realize, hey, we fought all those wars against Muslim and Christian rulers in the peninsula, guess we can't trust the Jews. This is silly. Quoting Henry Kamen. For long periods, close contact between 3 faiths, Christians, Muslim, and Jews, encouraged familiarity between cultures. Even military alliances were often made regardless of religion. When Christians went to war against the Muslims, it might be, a 13th century writer argued, neither because of the law of Muhammad nor because of the sect they hold to, but because of conflict over land. Christians had Muslims as vassals, and Muslims had Christians. Both similarly took Jews under their wing. He goes on to talk about periods of conflict, the wars, and the coexistence. It's important to understand that all of these things went hand in hand. Quoting further, "We can be certain of one thing. Spain was not, as often imagined, a society dominated exclusively by zealots. The 3 faiths had coexisted long enough for many people to accept a certain validity for all of them." Of course, here he is describing Spain prior to the Inquisition. Pax Tube talks about the difficulties Spain had faced from Jews and Muslims. Perhaps an argument can be made that the overall backdrop of conflict over the centuries in Iberia between Christians and Muslim lords represents such a difficulty. I would not frame it like that, and instead view each conflict on its own terms, rather than in a larger Christian versus Muslim narrative. But I understand where it's coming from, as he is a right-wing Christian. What cannot be understood, however, is how Jews are wrapped into this. The Jews were a minority in both Christian and Muslim lands, often persecuted by both. By the 1200s, they likely made up roughly 2% of Spain's total population. That's a very, very small population at the time. The difficulties here were entirely visited upon the Jews by the Christians, and Henry Kamen, who Pax Tube quotes, makes this very clear. Quote, "Religious fanaticism, stirred up in southern Spain in the 1370s and 1380s by Ferrant Martinez, Archdeacon of Iquia, lit the spark to this powder keg. In June 1391, during a hot summer made worse by economic distress, urban mobs rioted, directing their anger against the privileged classes and against the Jews. In Sevilla, hundreds of Jews were murdered and the Alhama was destroyed. In Valencia, during the month of July, some 250 were murdered. In Barcelona, during August, some 400. The major Alhamas of Spain were wiped out. Royal authorities in both Castile and Aragon denounced the excesses and tried, in the major cities, to protect the Jews. Many unprotected Jews were forced to become Christians. From this time, the Conversos came into existence on a grand scale. Their descendants are also referred to as Conversos. Given the forced nature of the mass conversions of 1391, it was obvious that many could not have been genuine Christians. The Conversos were inevitably regarded with suspicion as a 5th column within the church. Though no longer Jews in religion, they continued to suffer the rigors of anti-Semitism. Despite being a descendant of a Christian, you who did not convert to Christianity from Judaism were considered a convert, and possibly secretly Jewish. Your descent, your blood, made you Jewish, not your belief or actions. This is early racial thinking. This is the process of the invention of modern racism. Also, the clip he's using is lifted from a video by the channel Ollie by History, without citation or credit. I tend to not use other people's videos for illustrative purposes, but if you decide to do so, at the very least cite them or credit them. Response videos being the obvious exception to this, but for those you should also, of course, cite them. I've shown you some of his arguments and his clips not in the exact same order as he presented them, but in an order that is more conducive to illustrate what his video is actually about. If you want to watch the video in the way that he wanted to present it, it's linked below, and all the clips I've used are timestamped on screen. So here's what Pax Tube's video is really about.
The French revolutionary government killed more people in 1 month in the name of atheism. Religious tolerance, as we understand it, is a very modern idea, and it comes with its own problems. We have mass abortion, mass euthanasia, mass drug deaths, I could go on. And today we see the many ways a society based on atheistic philosophical principles is at odds with one based on Christian philosophy. In the United States in 2020, there were 500,000 abortions. That's 100 times as many deaths as the Spanish Inquisition over 300 years.
Pax Tube's video isn't so much about teaching about the Inquisition as it is about using it as a historical example and justification for discrimination, but also as a means of defense against modernity, which he calls atheism. While Pax Tube greatly enjoys many of the trappings of the modern world like anime and VTubers, he's less enthused about the ones we can trace back to the Enlightenment, like equal rights. Also, technically, there were 930,160 abortions in the United States in 2020, according to the Guttmacher Institute, and they support medical abortion. This only accounts for legal and safe abortions conducted in a clinical setting. That means it does not account for abortions conducted impromptu because they did not have access to a legal and safe clinical setting. This number is higher than the CDC's numbers, which don't account for all 50 states and are collected differently. Though those numbers I think are 630,000 plus. I don't know where he got 500,000 from. He can't even get his abortion scaremongering right. According to the CDC, abortion rates in 2020 were highest among those that are 19 and younger. These people are virtually children themselves. The CDC's proposed measure to lower abortion rates is increased access to contraceptives, which is opposed by right-wing Christians like Pax Tube. Also, comparing stake burnings to abortions is kind of insane. Now, stay with me here, because all this is going to wrap up neatly into one very anti-Semitic package. He brought up the deaths caused by the French Revolution in the name of atheism, which prompted me to have a look at his French Revolution video, in which Pax Tube on numerous occasions brings up Freemasonry, and attempts to frame the French Revolution as a Masonic conspiracy. He even goes as far as to claim Maximilien Robespierre was a Freemason, a thing that I'm pretty sure he just made up. The Freemasonry stuff he likely gets from the Jesuit priest Augustin Burrell or the Scottish physicist John Robinson, who authored conspiracy theories alleging the French Revolution was a Freemason plot. Quoting Peter Knight from Conspiracy Theories in American History, an encyclopedia. Christian conspiracy theorists in particular continue to contend that the group's agenda is both anti-Christian and anti-democratic. Late 20th and early 21st century conspiracy theorists see Freemasons as the key to the New World Order conspiracy. These conspiracy theories, levied against both the enemies of the French monarchy and the enemies of the Catholic Church surrounding the French Revolution, have a direct through line to a very particular brand of conspiracy theory. Quoting Darren McMahon from Enemies of the Enlightenment, the French Counter-Enlightenment, and the Making of Modernity. For Gustave Gatharon, however, philosophisme, which is French Enlightenment ideology, roughly speaking, was not just the animating principle of the revolution, but also a motive force of the, quote, gigantic drama that continues in the world between Christian civilization and the counter-civilization. Issued from Encyclopédisme, by which I believe he means Enlightenment thinking or the democratization of knowledge. Gautreau was a professor of history of the French Revolution at the Institut Catholique in Paris, who, according to McMahon, quote, repeated the anti-philosophe discourse in full. The philosophes were the thinkers behind the Enlightenment ideas of the French Revolution, and the Encyclopédie was the reference encyclopedia published in France with the goal of democratizing knowledge and informing the public. I'm simplifying extensively here for time. Quoting further, unfolding this drama in detail, he, Gautreau, charged the philosophes with responsibility for everything from the ravages of capitalist individualism to the international pacifism of Gustave Hervé. He dwelled at length, too, on the original philosophe conspiracy and its relation to the ongoing machinations of Freemasonry. Gautreau's work highlights the way in which anti-philosophe plot language could be refitted to account for later developments, providing a model for Manichaean opposition and an archetype of conspiratorial design. Theories of philosophe conspiracies were frequently employed by Catholics during the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, swept up into other narratives and applied to more immediate enemies. So who were these more immediate enemies that the Catholics and later others targeted by building on this larger conspiratorial framework? Quoting further from McMahon. As the German scholar Johannes Rogala von Bieberstein has pointed out, it is possible to trace the charge of conspirator against the social order in clear line of descent from the philosophe bugbear, that is, the French Enlightenment thinkers of the Revolution, of the 18th century through the Freemasons, Jewish, liberal, and socialist pariahs of the 19th century and 20th centuries. Right-wing bookshops throughout Europe are well stocked with such texts, decrying the, quote, noxiousness and perversity of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. In his French Revolution video, Pax Tube leans on the foundational grand conspiracy theories which gave rise to ideas that every revolution or popular mass movement was the result of some sort of devious conspiracy, a hidden rot in society that could have been rooted out. It, in essence, rejects the idea of mass politics or democratic action, alleging that every such historical moment was a conspiracy by a hidden minority that had manipulated the masses. The conspiracy framework was adapted to the Russian Empire, where the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, possibly authored by the Tsar's secret police, purported to show a Jewish plot for world domination, which, to right-wing conspiracy theorists, was realized with the mass politics of the Russian Revolution. This was further adapted in Nazi Germany in the form of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory, itself adapted by the anti-Semitic and anti-communist right in America into cultural Marxism. Quoting further from McMahon, it is far too easy to forget that what to many today seems perfectly innocuous values, tolerance, free speech, civil marriage and divorce, moral and economic laissez-faire, democracy and natural rights, were for many for long infected at their source. This is what Pax Tube is about. He longs for discrimination on the basis of religion, race, gender, and sexuality. There's nothing brave or novel about this, we've seen it all before. His specific highlighting of Jews as being untrustworthy in the Spanish Inquisition video could simply be read as him grasping for ways to defend the forcible conversion and expulsion of Spain's 200,000 Jews during the Inquisition. But it is well established by experts that even Pax Tube himself quoted that this was anti-Semitic, so any defense of it necessarily must endorse this anti-Semitism. He doesn't exactly make a big secret of it when on April 29th he appropriated anti-Zionist language to say Israel is anti-white, and turns, quote, white countries into slave colonies, while saying that they are destroying the reputation of these, quote, white nations with Israel's ongoing ethnic cleansing campaign against the Palestinian people. And he said, quote, Jews control the West. He's appropriating the language of anti-Zionism, that is, opposition to settler colonialism in Palestine, opposition to settler violence towards Arab Palestinians, and the ethnic cleansing of Muslims in the region. As Pax Tube wholeheartedly endorsed the Crusades, which sought to establish colonies in the region and displace both Muslims and Jews, I think it should be pretty obvious he doesn't really care much about the plight of the Palestinian people. In response to this, someone said that as a purported worshipper of God, he is being hateful to his people, to which he said he's merely following the older Catholic Church's doctrine of anti-Semitism. Around the time of the release of my response to this Crusade video, I was approached by someone who said they used to be in a Europa Universalis 4 multiplayer group with him being Pax Tube. They alleged that Pax Tube was eventually expelled from the group because he couldn't stop talking about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The story could be completely apocryphal, but it certainly seems fitting that Pax Tube would be anti-Semitic enough to even make a Paradox multiplayer group think he's weird. 100 years before the founding of the Inquisition, violent pogroms had broken out in Spain, killing hundreds of Jews. Those not killed were compelled to baptism. Over the century after, some came to believe that these Conversos were not truly Christian, but secret Jews, infiltrators in the church, possibly part of some greater conspiracy. 12 years after its founding, the Inquisition proposed the total expulsion of all Jews who would refuse baptism. The eventual edict to this end by the Crown did not carry the ferocious anti-Semitism of the original proposal by the Inquisition. Nobles were granted the property of, quote, their expelled Jews. 200,000 were given the choice to leave the country or be forcibly converted, and many who wished to convert were afraid to do so, because they feared the Inquisition would find some reason to punish them, and perhaps burn them at the stake.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the Inquisition was awesome indeed.
Thanks so much for watching. Special thank you to all the people who support me on Patreon. It's because of people like you I can take my time researching these videos. I had to sift through 7 books for this one on topics I'm not too well versed in. 10 if you count the other editions of Kamen's book that I had to check. And that takes time. Special thank you to the patrons who support me at the $10 tier. Rowan M, LeBeau, Vishire, Jordan M, and Monday's Last Brain Cell. The patrons at the $3 tier saw this video a week early. If you want to see videos early and more, check out the Patreon that's linked below.